Hi and welcome to Viacom's Hadion Weekly Podcast. I'm joined by Richard Pater in Israel. Calev is here with me in London. And we're very pleased to have with us a guest for today, Sarit Zehavi, who is the head of a research and education center in Israel called ALMA that examines the security challenges for the north of Israel. She's also a former senior officer in IDF military intelligence and the Northern Command. Sarit, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Last week we were talking on the podcast quite a lot about what was happening with the internal population movements in southern Syria, and it seemed like there were very, very large numbers of people being reported in the media as massing on the Jordanian and Israeli border, and this was seen as an indication that, you know, they were fearful of what would happen when the regime took more villages in the south. I just wonder if you could tell us what you think the situation is now.
As far as we understand, I visited the border almost every day in the past few days. The amount of refugees that came next to the Israeli border is no more than 20,000 people, and maybe even less than that. They concentrated in specific camps that we were already familiar with from before this recent incident. I must say that the word refugees is inaccurate because these people didn't cross into Israel and they didn't ask to cross into Israel. These people came to camps which are on the Syrian side of the border. They asked for help, and they were holding signs asking for help from many countries in the West, including the UK, United States, France, and Israel. And when I'm saying help, I don't necessarily mean refuge. They were asking to people from us in the West to help them in a way that they will not be slaughtered by the Syrian government and its allies.
And what do you think the situation is now for some of these rebel groups? It seems like there may be an accommodation with some of them as part of a wider deal. Do you see that happening, or do you think there will be fighting that will continue for some time? Because the Israeli army was saying they thought that this whole fight could be over in weeks.
Of course, that if there will be battles, the Israeli assessment, I agree with it, that the rebels don't have the military advantage to win the Shiite Axis and Russia. Some of the Shiite rebels groups already surrendered, but this happened in areas which are not that close to the Israeli border. And the discussion now is exactly on the areas which are closest to the Israeli border in a distance of top 15 kilometers, mostly areas which are supposed to be without any military presence of the Syrians by the disengagement agreements between Israel and Syria.
In terms of the wider picture, so Prime Minister Netanyahu is meeting President Putin to talk more about what is happening in southern Syria. He will press his red lines that he does not want an Iranian military presence. What do you think the Russians can do to guarantee some of the Israeli security demands, or do you think that's just not going to happen?
This is a big question. I think that we should defer at two levels. The level of getting to an agreement between Israel and Russia and Jordan and the United States about the question of the presence of Iran in Syria in general and the presence of Iran in Syria in southwest Syria. In this respect, we may get an agreement between all sides with some costs also for us, but I'm not sure that this agreement would be accepted by the Iranians themselves. And we are already seeing indications in the field that they are trying to assimilate the Shiite militias that they established in Syria in a way that they will be hidden like as part of the Syrian army and will actually enable Iran to continue its stronghold inside Syria.
I mean, that's the big fear, isn't it? I mean, I think that the main driver of what Israel is trying to do is to make sure that what happened in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah absolutely doesn't happen in southern Syria. That's correct, isn't it?
This is exactly the goal, the Israeli goal, to prevent a situation that Iran and Hezbollah and other Shiite militias will develop the same capabilities Hezbollah is having in South Lebanon on the Syrian border with Israel, and actually creating one big front on the Israeli north from the seashore of Lebanon to the Golan Heights.
And there's a wider battle, isn't there? I mean, not just the forces on the ground nearer to the Israeli border, but we saw a reminder just this week of foreign media saying that Israel had hit the T4 base again, and there was even reports that was kind of drone equipment or advanced anti-aircraft equipment. So there's this constant struggle as well to try and prevent Iran from bringing in more advanced equipment. I mean, we've seen that reach a very, very serious phase over the last few months. I mean, where do you see that going in the weeks and months ahead?
Well, Iran and Hezbollah already announced very clearly that they have an open feud with Israel. So the Israeli assessment is that we're not going for a peace process. And that's why it's not something that is happening recently. It's something that right from the beginning of the involvement of Hezbollah and Iran in Syria, Israel has been operating in Syria against strategical infrastructures there. And this is something that was reported in foreign reports, but also Israeli leadership admitted that it is operating in Syria in this way or another.
Yeah. But the interesting thing about that, I don't know if you can answer this question, but when we saw this happen in May, where there was foreign media reporting Israeli airstrikes, and Iran said it would respond, and it then responded in May when it fired a number of missiles at Israeli positions on the Golan, that was its response. So do we expect that Iran will try and respond again?
I think yes, because the Iranian response failed. On the one hand, they fired about 30 missiles to Israel, but on the other hand, none of them caused any damage or casualties. Most of them fell in the Syrian area, and some of them were intercepted by Iron Dome. So I think that the Iranians may try again.
Yeah. What do you think they might do? Do you think they'll try that again, or will they do something on a wider sphere?
This is pretty wide, 30 missiles at the same time. It meant that we had to stop the routine life on the Golan. It meant that people had to open shelters. It meant that we had to strengthen the army presence of the Golan. We cannot underestimate this kind of event.
In terms of the disruption to the north, understandable. And I mean, you're obviously doing a lot of research about the security of the north of Israel in general. And I wonder if you can tell us a bit about what this actually means for the people living in northern Israel, this ongoing battle.
Look, I live in the Western Galilee. The first Iranian attack against Israel just last February, I had to run for shelter with my 5 kids, and I knew that I had 9 seconds to do that. First, I couldn't do it in 9 seconds, and second, it is really horrifying. And I think that what Israel is trying to do is to make sure that we are not going to experience that all the time, because this is impossible to live like that. I don't want my kids to grow up under the sounds of the sirens.
Yeah, understood. Okay, Sarit, that's been really, really interesting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So thank you, Sarit. It was interesting what Sarit was saying about Putin and Bibi and their summit on Wednesday. And I think perhaps we should reflect on that a little bit more. I mean, this seems to be a regular pattern. Like Bibi goes off, he meets Putin. There's been allegedly an attack on an Iranian airbase by Israeli Air Force just before or just after. What do we think the dynamic is here? I mean, is Putin and Russia going to deliver anything substantive in southern Syria in the months ahead? Or is it just the case that they're going to keep things a little bit quieter as Assad retakes southern Syria? I'm interested to get your views. Who wants to start? Calev?
Well, I think Putin is definitely seen as a more effective address for Israeli concerns than the Trump administration, which is clearly a significant change when we look at history. This also touches on something Sarit said. I think there is a meeting of minds and interests between Israel and Russia regarding keeping Iran out of southwestern Syria. but I think it will be extremely difficult to implement the more comprehensive thing that Israel wants, which is to push Iran out of all of Syria. And that I don't think anyone really is going to be able to do, including Russia. And I'm also not sure that Russia necessarily want to use political or military capital on that specific issue. So I think southwestern Syria, everyone is aligned. On the rest of Syria getting Iran out, I think Israel will have difficulty implementing that.
But Israel seems to be having that level of freedom of maneuver that they wanted. That doesn't seem to be challenged still. I mean, in February, when there was this big attack, drone over Israeli airspace, Israel responded. Israel lost an F-16, and Russia made it very clear that it was sort of part of quietening things down. I think after that, we were all asking the question, okay, Israel isn't going to have the same level of freedom of maneuver it had before, but actually it's had just as much, if not more.
I was going
Isn't
to
that correct?
say,
Richard, what do you think?
I think the Israeli government's objectives here are a little more limited. I think, although they will pay lip service to the idea of the uncomfortable nature of the Iranian presence, I think the main goal that Israel will be articulating, that it has done for the last year or two, is just to ensure they have freedom of action over the skies, that Putin understands Israel has their red lines and they will continue to act and will continue to coordinate or have this deconfliction mechanism, which is working very well. So the Russians and, God forbid, Israel and the Russian Air Force would directly engage, or even indirectly, but Israel will continue to enforce its red lines and target those Iranian assets that it sees as a strategic threat.
But there was, interestingly, I read a piece by Amos Harel in Haaretz this week, and he was talking more about, how far the buffer zone will extend, where Israel wants Iranian and Shia militias not to be in position. And there are some crazy numbers being thrown around, like up to sort of 70 or 80 kilometers, which I have to say I don't understand because Damascus is only, 70 plus kilometers away. And I know I've made this point before, but it's a pipe dream to think that there's going to be no one up to 70 plus kilometers away if Damascus is there. I mean, there are major bases there. So that seems strange. But there also still seems to be this idea that Russia will be policing areas, that there'll be Russian military policemen. I mean, I don't know, I might be wrong, but I feel a little bit that maybe the next few months will be Assad retakes control in southern Syria. He pushes up towards Idlib, retakes what they call kind of useful Syria. I don't necessarily see the Russians there in as much force as they are now. I think maybe they're looking at sort of a 6 month drawdown. I don't know. I don't know how we feel about that, but I think we're making decisions now and analysis now based on a Russian presence that won't exist in 6 months to a year. I don't know what people think of that.
Well, I think we touched on this last time. The main Russian interest is making sure that the Alawite regime remains stable. And if they're convinced that a continued Iranian presence will draw an Israeli response that will then inevitably undermine Assad's regime, then I think they will be forced to act. But it's a complicated maneuver with lots of competing interests. And I think there's a lot of criticism of Netanyahu about a lot of different things. But I think many people believe that the Syrian angle has actually been played very responsibly so far.
I mean, I just think in the context.
Richard, any final thoughts on that before we move on?
Yet again, that kind of just to highlight how carefully Israel is maneuvering itself between the world powers. And I think the other issue, obviously, on Putin's agenda is the meeting next week with President Trump. And all of this, the issues around Syria, have been seen here as part of just a small piece of the global game of kind of the understandings that the US and Russia need to reach over NATO, over the Crimea, over issues around China and North Korea, and so it's unclear where this will fall down between US and Russia trade-offs, and Israel is just kind of having to ensure that their position is fully understood and articulated to both the US and the Russians ahead of that meeting.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, I want to conclude by just having a little bit of a discussion about Israeli domestic politics, and the reason why I was thinking about this was, as people will know who are following UK politics, they'll know that we had a pretty tumultuous 24 hours in British politics yesterday. Prime Minister Theresa May had to deal with the resignation of two senior cabinet ministers who support a very hard Brexit. Boris Johnson's Foreign Secretary, David Davis, as Secretary of State for exiting the EU. That was two cabinet ministers, which brings the total of cabinet ministers that have resigned or been sacked from the cabinet since summer 2017 to seven, which is an extraordinary number of cabinet ministers to lose, and reminds me of the old adage that sort of British politics was incredibly stable, one party in power with a strong mandate. Israeli politics was the unstable political system with multiple resignations and multiple parties in coalition. Yet we seem to have kind of had a reverse. I mean, British politics is an unstable coalition of pro-Brexit and not such pro-Brexit conservatives in an uneasy coalition together. British politics is still dealing with the shockwaves of the result of the Brexit referendum in 2016, but yet, amazingly, Israeli politics is bizarrely stable. I mean, we haven't really had any resignations that I can really think of recently. The government seems incredibly strong ever since kind of Avigdor Lieberman was brought in with Israel Beitenu and Moshe Ya'alon was kind of removed as defense minister. And interestingly, earlier this year, Bibi Netanyahu was really being put under pressure by the details of the various corruption investigations into him. The police said that he should be indicted. That's now with the Attorney General. And there was a moment where it seemed like, can Bibi run the country, where he's having to have so many meetings with his lawyers? And I remember thinking at the time, if he makes it to the summer, then he would have done well. But here we are in the summer, and certainly all the conversations that I was having recently with Israeli journalists was that Bibi is stronger than ever. I mean, the U.S. embassy was moved to Jerusalem. Trump left the Iran deal. Bibi seems unassailable. I mean, is it an accurate reflection, or is that just a very partial glimpse of what's going on? Richard, what do you think?
The idea here, usually people, when they bolt the government to bring down the government, you rarely see kind of individual ministers resigning. The one exception was, as you mentioned, around the appointment when 2 years ago now, when Moshe Ya'alon was replaced by Avigdor Lieberman, and Avi Gabay, who was a minister without serving as an MK, resigned his environment ministry portfolio and has since gone on to become the chairman of Labour. So that was the last kind of cabinet reshuffle, so to speak, that we had here. Ostensibly, you're right that the Bibi is very strong. All the polls are showing he's popular, probably at almost at peak popularity right now. And some of this can be explained with the extraordinary good relationship he has with President Trump. He's been waiting for a decade to serve alongside a Republican president, and although this Republican president doesn't necessarily fit the conventional billing, clearly as you mentioned, on both the Iran issue and on Jerusalem and on this the peace process that we're still waiting to have revealed, that the US and Israel are very well coordinated. Perhaps it's worth, though, just flagging up 2 or 3 issues coming down the track that could potentially unsettle the coalition. I don't think ultimately they will bring down the government, but it will make a slightly more rocky ride. I think one of the issues is the conscription bill, which is going through a process. It passed its first reading. The ultra-Orthodox voted against it. They have claimed that they are very unhappy about it. Obviously, this refers to the induction into the army of the yeshiva students, of religious students serving in religious seminaries, and the ultra-Orthodox traditionally been very, very, very anti that proposal. We'll see now that it's in the draft stage, back in the committee stage. Sorry, that will it be edited and a version more appealing to their ilk will transpire. At the moment, the draft is being put forward by the professionals within the Ministry of Defence, and as I said, the ultra-Orthodox are not happy about it and have voted against it. A second issue, also kind of on the religious and state axis, is the issue of the expansion of the non-Orthodox section of egalitarian prayer at the Western Wall. We've had 3 resignations from a subcommittee of ministers, both from the Likud party and also from Shas and the Jewish Home. 3 ministers have resigned in the last week or so, and Netanyahu is left to having now postponed that decision. This is obviously a particularly sensitive issue between Israel-diaspora relations, particularly US Jewry, which is so well represented by the non-Orthodox streams of Judaism that feel that the Kotel, being holy to all Jews, should find expression for them to worship as well. So that's very challenging. And finally, there. Well, the Kotel piece, I think, has a slightly longer life.
Well, could I just ask, when do you think those two will come to a head in terms of timing?
Prime Minister Netanyahu and Yuval Steinitz, his ally, they've been able to postpone it, so there's no direct time pressure on that. In terms of the conscription bill, they have said that they want to complete it even by the end of the month of July. So we will see that in the next few weeks come to a head, and when we get a second or third reading, we'll understand. The devil will be in the details about whether it be criminalisation, whether the stage of quotas will be acceptable to the ultra-Orthodox, and then we'll really be in crunch time there.
Right. Okay. That's very interesting. Calev, is there anything you wanted to?
Well, I think Netanyahu is helped by the fact that none of the coalition partners are really particularly eager for elections. I think all of them are likely to lose seats in an election. I think that Zionist Union, although clearly they would like to bring the government down, I think they would also quite like more time in order to organize themselves. So I think in some ways that helps Netanyahu. As Richard said, he's also had a number of diplomatic achievements, but in some ways the elephant in the room, and we don't know when this is going to happen, but there's an Attorney General decision coming down the line regarding indictments, and that would shake everything up. So we don't know when it's going to be, but when that does happen, we will be in a very different place.
Predictions of when that's going to be? What do you think?
It's going to come to a head towards right at the end of this year, early next year.
I had thought it would be sometime in 2018, but now I'm not sure.
Richard?
To the Prime Minister. He was over the weekend predicting general elections February, March 2019. And this is the guy that usually knows these things. So that for me seems quite a likely scenario, and that could coincide with the investigation coming, and then Netanyahu can go to the electorate with that on the agenda and reinvigorate his mandate in that context.
Yeah. Yeah, and let's not forget as well that Sarah Netanyahu, her trial, if it goes to trial, which at the moment it looks like it is, will start in October. It was due to start in this month, but it was postponed. So there is that kind of bump in the road to navigate for the Netanyahu family. Let's also remind ourselves that in BICOM's forecast for 2018, we predicted a number of things which have come true. So far this year. One of the things we also predicted about Israeli domestic politics was that Bibi Netanyahu would somehow take the country to elections in 2018. So we're not yet, I'm not yet leaving that prediction because we predicted it. So I'm sticking with it. But it sounds like it might be the case that doesn't happen until next year. Gentlemen, as ever, thank you so much for your insight and your expertise. And we will speak again next week.